Today we have Andreas, who is the head of industry principal architects, financial services at Google Cloud for APAC. I think the billion or trillion dollar question these days is that what are the most common use cases of generative AI in financial services?
If I try to summarize it or bring it down to maybe two key words on how you can identify those use cases, I would actually call them use cases related to effectiveness and use cases related to efficiency.
I know it may be difficult for Google perspective, but there may be some stuff that you have put out in the public domain. If you can actually walk us through line case study, what we are trying to understand is if there's a case where generative AI radically changed the equation and even you were surprised by the outcome.
A large Singaporean bank, DBS, has publicly announced to be using Google Cloud technology for a large part of their AI transformation projects. They generated more than $750 million in revenue.
Things are going from pilots, POCs to production. But then, of course, there are many financial institutions who may still have, various types of issues.
Opening up these kind of capabilities raises a whole set of new concerns. It's like, is it secure? Is it compliant regulations? What about hallucinations? So overcoming this kind of mental hurdle is quite important to move into this new segment or category of use cases.
Build AI, push the limit, conversations with no gimmick. Tech and juice collide in sync. That you're on, don't stop to think.
Hello everyone to yet another episode of Build AI by GI Ventures. Today we have Andreas, who is the head of industry principal architects, financial services at Google Cloud for APAC. I'm looking forward to this discussion, given that Andreas comes from a big tech company, and so far we have interviewed a bunch of founders. So he brings a new perspective, a different perspective, and looking forward to hearing that. I think it will be a good start to hear from you that what is this role exactly and what do you do? And also, how did you get pulled into this intersection of what seems like cloud AI and financial services?
Hey, Amit. First and foremost, thank you so much for having me on your podcast. So I'm very excited to be here today. And thanks so much for the introduction. So as you said, myself, Andreas, I lead the industry principal architects for financial services in Google Cloud Asia Pacific. I'm based out of Singapore. I'm in Singapore for more than 10 years now. And I've worked most of my career in the financial services industry. In Google Cloud, the industry principal architects is a team of very seasoned senior industry experts for financial services, both banking and insurance, that bring a wealth of experience on the technical side as well. So I have people in my team that have been chief digital officers in banks, implementing large-scale data platform transformation, as well as industry architects from the banking side themselves. So what we do in Google Cloud is we are working with our customers to give them an understanding of how the capabilities that Google Cloud offers, whether it's infrastructure services, product services, or most recently with our advancement in AI in terms of large language models and those type of products. So we are working with the senior stakeholders in the banks, whether it's CIOs, CTOs, or alike, to help them understand how this technology can support their KPIs, their objectives that they have, and eventually map those capabilities to the digital transformation agenda that the banks and insurers in the regions have.
Right, very interesting. And I'm assuming that this organization within Google Cloud is there in other parts of the world as well, apart from APAC, right? So this is does it look like symmetrical organization in the US and Europe as well?
We like to say Asia is always a bit specific, but yeah, there is obviously a strong alignment to the global team. So this type of organization exists in Europe and North America as well. So there is a global community within Google Cloud that continuously exchanges their experiences and success stories that they have, so that we all can learn from each other.
Right. This seems like a very interesting role, and I wanted to ask you that your background, you have worked at in financial services, consulting firms. And was there like a specific reason or a specific moment how you got into this particular role at the intersection of AI, cloud, and financial services?
I think there was no specific moment, but it was more like an evolution of the work that I've done in the past 20 to 25 years, I would say. I think I've always worked in a deep technical role, mostly on enterprise solution side, whether it was like in the start of my career, semiconductor business, or later on in the oil and gas trading industry. It was always like how to implement those enterprise solutions in the context of a customer environment and ensure that the solution is deployed in a highly scalable and performant way. That obviously back then happened largely on huge server farms. So I've done implementations in Europe where we've implemented trading and risk management solutions for the largest electricity producer in the northern part of Europe. And obviously, as part of their day-to-day operational processes, the solution had to complete certain calculations and end-of-day processes. And these kind of like calculations could take like days to complete. Implementing a solution that connects hundreds of servers together in a grid-like computing setup to help accelerate those number crunching. That was part of the role that I was doing. And as I then subsequently moved to Asia and transitioned more and more into financial services, the problem statement obviously remained the same. Financial services institutions, banks and insurers, they are number crunching like a huge amount of data every day to come up with like predictions, reports and other information. And those type of like outcome that need to be generated obviously need to be calculated and generated in a way so that the end user who is consuming that outcome can receive that information in the most efficient and shortest possible time. So when we did these type of like implementations, this new type of like technology emerged, which was like cloud. Quite interesting at first, but obviously within the highly regulated environment of banking and insurance, it was more like a topic that was known to the CIOs and CTOs of the banks, but not actively pursued because the services were not mature enough. There was still like a lot of uncertainty from regulators across the region. Policies and compliance teams didn't know of how to approach this type of like technology, but things have obviously, as we all know, changed over the years. So as I progressed my career, solutions that have been developed in a more cloud native kind of like fashion. So one of my career highlights in the past 25 years has been working for a UK startup that developed cloud native core banking technology, which was very progressive and new at the time when the founder decided to go down that route. And trying to bring that technology into Asia Pacific and convince a lot of very traditional banks to make use of this type of technology, but also load the operating and processing of data from their on-premise environments where it's highly secure, it's very contained, into a public cloud environment was at times very challenging, but also quite interesting for me to learn. And I would say that the move into Google Cloud was then just a natural evolution because I've been working on this type of technology for many, many years and now sitting directly at the source, I would say, having access to all those innovations firsthand that are being released almost like daily in the pipeline of Google and Google Cloud is actually quite amazing to be part of it.
Yeah, that sounds like a fascinating journey. And I think you have seen this industry now from various angles. In fact, that's a good segue into my next question that I think the billion or trillion dollar question these days is that what are the most common use cases of generative AI in financial services? And I know that you actually have a vantage point in kind of giving that answer. So, please tell us, like, what is it you are seeing in terms of the most common use cases?
Yeah, so that's obviously a very great question, and it's something that I'm being faced with almost on a daily basis. So generative AI, but also predictive AI, has been around in banking and insurance for quite a while now. So we've spend quite an enormous amount of time and effort with our customers and prospects to identify use cases that can be applied to this technology. But if I try to summarize it or bring it down to maybe two key words on how you can identify those use cases, I would actually call them use cases related to effectiveness and use cases related to efficiency. I would say, I think in the last 18 months or so, most financial institutions have experimented around with like use cases that improve the efficiency of their internal processes and operations. So we've seen a lot of use cases specifically around how do you process documents and summarize the content of those documents in a meaningful way so that the unstructured data becomes structured and can be used for further processing. We obviously see most recently now with the advancements in large language models and the capability of providing code assist capabilities, use cases around like code generation and development. So again, improving the employee efficiency, specifically the developers within banks to help them write new code and write the code faster and more efficiently is something that is quite useful. And another use case I would say specifically in that category is around report generation. So how do you extract the vast amount of data that is available in the financial services universe, all these like industry reports, like the company filings, pricing information from exchanges and others. How do you basically consolidate this information and create a report so that a human can digest this information in a fast and meaningful way is obviously some of the key use cases in this category.
That's a very interesting framework. So you said basically effectiveness and efficiency. I think from what we have experienced at GenAI Ventures, the companies that we are building, pretty much like the first wave seems to be a whole lot of efficiency related stuff and productivity related stuff. What would you put in the effectiveness category?
So in the effectiveness category is obviously any solution or use case that generates new revenues for the bank. So that comes now with a new set of complexities. The internal employee efficiency use cases, they were all very contained in terms of like, okay, it only addresses internal employees and the number of internal customers it's being exposed to is somewhat like a controlled environment. Now, opening up these kind of like capabilities to the customers of the bank, like external customers, raises a whole set of new concerns. Is it like secure? Is it like compliant to regulations? What about hallucinations and other type of like issues that can come up that banks have experienced with early versions of that new technology? So overcoming this kind of like mental hurdle in a lot of banks is quite important to move into this new segment or category of use cases. So the use cases that we see here is first and foremost, I would say, hyperpersonalization. I think hyperpersonalization obviously has been around for many, many years, and there have been a lot of technologies in the market that use machine learning models and other type of like technologies to collect the data of your customer, like transactional data mostly, and then predict certain behavior based on pattern analysis and other type of like segmentation. So this kind of like created a set of like personalization options, but didn't go into that level of hyper-personalization that we think is now possible with large language models. Large language models have the ability to process any type of data, whether it's like a structured data in the form of like text input or documents that are being received, or unstructured data that could be like audio files, information that is being gathered from social media, or, for example, video information. So consolidating all these different type of like information and then using predictive AI, but also generative AI to interact with the customer and recommend maybe financial services or recommend things to do within the bank that the user might not know at the time when the information is being received. I think that's the next big thing that has to be implemented in banking, because the better you understand your customer, the better the services are being offered to your customer, and the higher the success rate in terms of like conversion activation or cross-sell ups would be with this type of customers.
Right. And that improves the effectiveness of the service being offered. That's a great way to put it. Actually, there's no use case discussion in financial services GenAI which is complete without talking about the segments and the subsegments. Could you throw some light on, like, we are talking here about, let's say, lending, accounting, wealth management, and so on. From that particular angle, where do you see the most common use cases today?
I think there is specifically vertical use cases, and then there is horizontal use cases, right? So the horizontal use case that we can see is specifically around intelligent virtual chatbots that can be used to interact with your customers. So this is regardless of the business function that you operate in, whether it's like retail banking, corporate banking, private banking, wealth management. There is a need to provide or offer 24/7 type of service to your customers that is consistent and also personalized in a way so that it speaks the language of the customer and provides the information based on the underlying data that is available from the customer itself. So this is obviously some of the horizontal use cases. But if we are going into more of the vertical use cases, then they are very specialized to the individual line of business itself. So a few examples here could be in wealth management, some sort of a financial planning and advice type of agent that can offer you personalized investment advice, or on your wealth platform continuously monitors and analyze your stock portfolio and recommends you to, for example, change the allocation in the portfolio based on the information that is being received from media and sentiment analysis, and so on and so forth. We also see specific use cases to address certain issues in corporate banking. Banking, as of today, is still an industry which is very manual, very paper-based, specifically corporate banking, right? So if we think about trade finance or corporate lending, there is a plethora of documents that need to be filled out in different type of quality and formats. So the time to process this type of information requires a lot of resources on the banks in terms of human resources, but also time. To optimize this, there is specific use cases on how you extract the information by OCR, the documents, entity tagging, and then comparing it to certain internal databases to reduce the time to yes for these type of use cases significantly.
Right. That's super interesting, actually. And I'm going to ask you something more specific. I know it may be difficult from a Google perspective, but there may be some stuff that you have put out in the public domain, especially around, let's say, a client story, a case study. I wanted to know if you can actually walk us through a client case study. And, what we are trying to understand is if there's a case where generative AI radically changed the equation and even you were surprised by the outcome.
Yeah. I think one of the customers that is using AI very successfully is a large Singaporean bank, DBS. So DBS has publicly announced to be using Google Cloud technology for a large part of their AI transformation projects. And when we started working with DBS, it was quite interesting to see, because one thing that they have applied from the very early stages of their advancements into AI is to implement a very clear framework on how they are going to measure success on the outcome of the use cases that they are implementing using this type of technologies. So these type of measurements include KPIs of how much revenue can be generated, how much efficiency can be implemented, and other things. Just recently, I think in April this year, DBS announced that in 2024, with all these different type of AI initiatives that they have launched using the platform, they generated more than $750 million in revenue, which is quite a staggering number if you imagine, because I think we are still living in a world where in 2024, a lot of management consulting companies, banks, CIOs were running around on the assumption that their competitors or their customers implementing GenAI and AI use cases primarily to experiment and run POCs. But seeing here that DBS as the leading digital bank in Asia Pacific has created such a strong outcome is, I think, market leading. And a lot of banks are looking into those numbers and are wondering of what is DBS doing differently to us, and how can we basically follow their lead and generate a similar type of outcome.
Right. And we will try to put up some of this, case study since it's available in the public domain for the audience later on. It's very interesting. Like DBS was one of our customers back in my previous startup, Medici, and I love the level of details they go to benchmark best-in-class products and how they sort of work towards it. And so it's no surprise that they are early into this as well. In fact, what is very interesting is in some of the other geographies also, we have seen some of the largest companies, which were usually slow to adopt new technology. Today, they are going ahead and doing generative AI pilots and even implementations way ahead of like some of the small to mid-sized players. So something very different is happening with GenAI. And at the same time, since we are talking about bigger companies, this whole thing around pilots and POCs, I think we see them, across the world, it's happening. And, but I think there's this big question that when do we move from pilots, POCs to mass scale adoption? Or maybe you are already seeing it. Like, what is your read of the market currently?
Yeah, so I think the market has kind of like transitioned now from experimenting with AI to implementing AI. So there is a clear trend towards like a top-down approach in many banks that we are talking to, where the top leadership in banks is basically mandating a mind shift change within their organizations to implement AI at every possible business process within the bank. So these are like really transformational changes that are currently happening, which obviously raises a lot of concerns and questions as well on how to implement and execute such a change. One thing that we've also noticed now is that while banks have experimented on use cases in 2024, now with the advancement of agents, there is finally a technology in place that allows them to combine these single use cases to like an end-to-end user journey and process to potentially augment or complement existing workflows within the bank. And I think this is starting to become more prevalent now that this technology is allowing the banks to implement AI in a large-scale motion. Because before that, obviously, you have specific single use cases like report generation, chatbots, and others. But the technology didn't allow you to have this kind of like a combination of different tasks and keep the memory of those tasks as well, so that you can process it through different steps of a workflow or process flow. And with the capability that is now available, we see a lot of banks now that are rushing to basically identify processes within the bank where this technology can be implemented as a multi-agent type of like implementation.
Great. And it's great to hear, and it's very reassuring that, things are going from pilots, POCs to production. But then, of course, there are many financial institutions who may still have, various types of issues. It could be people mindset to change. It could be policy issues. It could be compliance. It could be so. Like, how is it first of all different from what used to happen during the fintech days, and now do you see like a lot of this is still happening in terms of roadblocks to implementation of GenAI use cases?
I think nothing is changing because fintech has always been operating in a highly regulated environment, right? So it is about customer data and customer information, and it needs to be highly protected and secured, so there can be no leakages and other sort of like incidents. So when we talk about this type of like roadblocks and issues, first and foremost, the first question always comes to mind is like security and compliance. So how do you implement this new technology in a way so that it follows the regulatory requirements, but also the compliance rules and policies the banks have set themselves to protect their customer information accordingly. So banks are approaching this in different ways and means, but we have seen the most successful customers of Google Cloud that implement a platform approach. A platform approach in a way where we can see that they follow an AI governance platform, which basically decouples the use case implementation from the underlying infrastructure and technology solution. How do we achieve that? Is basically by creating a set of capabilities where we basically templatize the services that Google Cloud offers in that regard. For example, like the access to Gemini, the prompts that can be to use, so that these type of like templates can be audited, can be verified by security, and can be approved by compliance, so that whenever there is a new use case that is being implemented, the banks don't have to go through the same cycle of like, okay, I need to get security approval, I need to fill out 3,000 questions of my security questionnaire, I need to talk to my compliance officer, and so on and so forth. So this dramatically accelerates the launch of new use cases in production and helps the banks to mitigate the concerns and the risk eventually as well that comes with implementing these type of like new technologies. So setting this aside, then obviously the second concern is a lot around the uncertainty that exists of whether the answer or the output that my AI model is generating actually makes sense, obviously. So transparency and explainability in the AI is important. So you need to create like a robust framework with guardrails and security around it that you can continuously validate and measure the output that is being generated, and that it aligns to the risk framework that is available within the banks. And last but not least, within that context, we obviously have ethical issues, right? So addressing potential biases in the training data that is available, and how to basically make sure that there is no discriminatory outcome of specifically the information that is being produced for the customers that are external to the bank. So putting again guardrails around this and quality controls in place is important. If we then think about the second part, I think it's also something that is not to neglect is many banks in Asia Pacific, but also globally, built on technology that was launched many years ago. So if I say many years ago, we are talking about like technologies that have launched like decades ago, and banks have never completely rebuilt the architecture. They have always kind of like built on top of what is already existing to implement new features and functionalities and use cases. So a lot of banks, obviously as a result of that, living in an technology nightmare, I would say, where there is a spaghetti architecture in place where you have like millions of different types of like solutions in different levels of maturity in terms of technologies and others, and fragmented and siloed data buckets that exist across the enterprise. So AI obviously is a very data hungry application. So it requires a lot of information, and accessing that information by integrating into all of these legacy systems can become quite cumbersome and difficult to achieve.
Right. This actually reminds me, I was at a bank many years ago and they showed me like this big printout that they had with all the various applications that they had implemented in the bank over the years. And I think it was somewhere like 150 plus things. And I think there was like every 5 years, they would have like a few more and then a few more. And it was all bolted onto a previous platform or a new platform. And it is messy. I can relate to what you're saying.
I have a fun story to that as well. So I was once working with a bank in Thailand, and we were talking about like digital transformation of some of their backend systems. And these backend systems were like, as I mentioned, like decades old in the bank. And the technical teams there asked us for recommendations on how they can sniff the network, because they couldn't find out anymore on all the integrations that go into that system. So they were looking for all the source systems and the destination systems going in and out of this application. And there was no network map, no architecture map available. And people that have implemented the system have long gone into retirement or moved on to other banks. So that was quite an interesting anecdote as well in this context.
Yeah. I'm assuming like from a Google Cloud perspective, you are sort of, I don't know what's the right term. Is it bundling or is it adjacency of how you're offering your foundational models along with the cloud, or what's the approach now?
So basically, we offer our models in different type of like bundles. So we have our Flash model, we have Pro model, and different type of other models. We basically, or as a customer of Google Cloud, we will work with you to identify what is the most appropriate model for the use case that is available to you. We have our platform technology called Vertex AI that has access to all of the large language models that Google offers, but access to a model garden of more than 200 additional models that is available within our environment, but also direct integration into Hugging Face, for example, where you can download your open source models and run them on Google Cloud technology if you're interested to do so. For all the models that Google Cloud offers, there is documentation available, for example, like a model map information that gives you information of what is the underlying training data that has been used and the use cases that it is most applicable to be used for, so that you as an end user of technology can make those decisions in the best possible way.
Right. That's good to know. And actually, sort of, I'm changing tracks now, going more to financial services specific. So, like most of the AI stack today feels off the shelf. But I have spent probably like 12, 13 years in fintech financial services. You have spent more. But, what we know about financial services is deeply verticalized, and it has like very specific workflows. Like one of the companies that we are building, Fast Tracker AI, which focuses on RIAs, the workflows are so nuanced. The onboarding which happens is so different from, say, lending or a banking account. And same thing with like the kind of processes around how do you take meeting notes, what kind of CRMs are there. And so like I wanted to know from you, like what's the hard part about building the infrastructure and solutions that adapt across like, wealth, credit scoring, retail, fintech, and that too across geographies, right? So how should how Google thinks about it and how should startups think about it, given that the need is of very specialized, verticalized applications for specific workflows, but then you also want to build it in such a way that it can expand later on. And so there's an infrastructure and solutioning problem here.
Yeah, so obviously it's a very crucial question that needs to be addressed. So I think if you think about AI use cases, I think what is the common denominator for those AI use cases? And I've mentioned this in a previous question. I think AI, generative AI as well as predictive AI is very data hungry, right? So it basically can only produce meaningful output if the data that is feeding into those models is meaningful at the same time. So the data verticalization and the contextual nuances of that is, I think, the most critical part. So when I talk to banks, I like to say that many years, I think banks have always followed this approach that at the heart of the bank, I would say, is the core banking application that processes all the information and provides the output of that processing to the omni-channel solutions that is required to service their customers. But I think with the advancement of AI, data has become the new gold, right? So I know that is quite a term that has been used in many different ways, but it is very true. If we think about the heart of the bank today, we have to think of it as the data lake that consolidates all the information that is available for the customer and builds that very holistic customer 360 the profile. So whether it's like a retail customer, whether it's like a corporate customer, or whether it's any other type of customer that the banks are servicing themselves. So the data verticalization and consolidation and provisioning becomes very crucial in that context. So implementing strategies here to avoid silos of data, obviously, but create domain-specific data products within the bank so that they can be consumed easily by the consumers that require the information in the best possible way. So data in wealth management, for example, is completely different to data that is being used in credit scoring or, for example, in trade finance, I would say. So to have that kind of like productization of data is quite important so that whoever consumes the data can make most meaningful use of the data in the most efficient way. Also, I think we are living in a world that is highly digitized now. So many customers of banks are consuming their financial services through digital ways and means. So I think the emergence of digital banks across the world is proof to that, and the digitization of the channels that are being used to interact with your relationship manager or provider of the bank is becoming more and more. So that obviously also leads to a great number of variety of unstructured data that can be created or consumed from the banks, such as like news information, video information, voice information. But more recently as well, when we go into that context of hyperpersonalization, again, it's like how do you collect behavioral data of your customers? So behavioral data, for example, how do they interact with the mobile device that they are using to consume your financial services? How fast do they click yes? Are they uploading certain documents? Do they revert to previous steps of the workflow and so on and so forth? Consuming that information and providing that to the processing platforms is quite important.
Super interesting. I actually sold our company to Prove acquired Unify ID, which was one of the leaders in behavioral biometrics, and spent a bunch of time with that team when we were trying to launch it in Asia. But I think what you said about data is so important, right? I feel like a lot of entrepreneurs who are building GenAI companies do not realize. Like I had this discussion with pretty senior guy at Klarna, and they said look, it took us more than a year to figure out this whole data lake situation. How do we get the data to be streamed to this one place so that real-time enterprise searches can happen and so on and so forth? People don't realize that the actual applications of AI did not take us much time. It's the data lake, and how do you manage the data is where you should spend a whole lot of time. And they also pride themselves by saying that is what differentiates them from a traditional bank, because they were able to do that process. And it may be not easy for a lot of traditional financial institutions to do that.
I think a lot of fintech applications as well have that issue of creating copies of the data. So in the context of the conversations I have with the banks, if we propose like a new solution, one of the first questions that always comes up is like, oh, do we need to create another copy of our data and put it into a new database? And how do we ensure the consistency of data and everything else in terms of like replication and storage and volumes and so on? So that is obviously creating a lot of concerns, because it is kind of like moving into this issue that has always existed in banks, which is like banks have always operated data in a lot of silos that do not interact with each other. And while the solutions that you are referring to, like fintech's application, might not consider that as their problem, they are obviously one of the creators of these type of like issues, because banks are kind of like forced to create all these like copies of data and eventually continue to keep those silos in place.
Right. I am going to switch gears quickly here. A couple of quick questions. When you're talking to banks and financial institutions, are they choosing one foundational model? Let's say Google found generative AI foundational models, or they are trying to use all? And what's the situation right now?
I think there has been a lot of experimentation, which has led to a lot of banks implementing an approach where they select models for specific use cases. So obviously there have been use cases or traditionally Anthropic has been very strong on code assist type of like use cases, whereas Llama has been very strong on certain other use cases. And most recently, when DeepSeek was kind of like coming out, obviously a lot of customers of Google Cloud were interested into exploring this type of like model for use cases that don't require a lot of guarantee, because the processing of the model itself was very cheap. So I think that is a situation that has existed since the beginning of the year. What we are now seeing obviously is like models become more mature. At the moment, obviously Gemini is leading the pack with a lot of like industry benchmarks where we are leading in terms of like, okay, capabilities and use cases that you can use Gemini models for. But one thing I think, and a KPI that is becoming more and more important to a lot of customers that we are talking to is like, how much intelligence can you actually generate out of an API call by using or running one prompt AI. And if you look at the latest benchmarks, then you would clearly see that Gemini here is quite leading as well. So it generates most intelligent out of seeing a prompt, which is actually quite important for banks, obviously, to realize the KPIs and the targets that they have applied to their use cases and implementations of AI.
Very interesting. A related question. So, when it comes to sort of generative AI applications, have you seen any bank which is actually trying to do this in-house as opposed to like buy from outside?
It's quite an interesting conversation I just recently had within the office as well. And the question was if any banks are basically training their own model. The reality, I think, is so far with most of the banks I've been speaking to, they would prefer to use like out-of-the-box models themselves, like pre-trained models, and then use like RAG, for example, to inject the data that they require for inference and other type of like use cases. The reason for that is that I think for the last 18 months, training the model has been just too expensive. We have to say it as it is. I think if you're trying to create your own foundational model and train it with the data, first, as a bank, you probably don't have access to the vast amount of data that is required to train the model firsthand. And then second, like training the model and running it on infrastructure, whether it is your on-premise environment or it is running on Google Cloud Technology, for example, it's just been too expensive, and therefore banks have not really been exploring that option to a large extent.
Right. And what about the application layer? Let's say a bank needs a document processing engine, for example. Have you seen like any bank or FI trying to build this in-house?
Yes, so I think the most prominent example that we can see here is that a lot of banks, or not a lot of banks, but there is banks that basically always keep having these conversations around build versus buy for their core banking applications. Specifically banks that aspire to have like, or they are operating in very complex environments where they potentially deploy their financial services in a fragmented set of markets with different regulatory requirements and other kind of like nuances. So they obviously would like to have like a certain level of control of their applications and the services that they offer. So they have followed down the route of build versus buy. And we recently had a number of these kind of like conversations with our customers as well. But the problem that I see here is like, okay, with the advancement of cloud and now with AI, I think the pace of innovation is so significant, and the amount of effort and in terms of like resources required, but also like cost that is involved and the time that is being spent on to create like a new solution, does that really benefit the overall objective of the bank of creating more revenue, reducing operational cost, and increasing time to market for certain capabilities and functions? I think that is a question that banks have to answer for themselves, but based on my experience, most of the time, I think a measured approach of where you can buy a solution off the shelf that offers you a platform approach where you can have the flexibility to configure and build on top, I think is usually more beneficial than building everything from scratch by yourself, because there is a reason why fintechs exist and they spend hundreds of millions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of developer hours to build the solutions that you deploy into your banking environment, and why it is not so easy to do the same in the context of just a bank. I'm sure there is certain banks that are successful in applying these type of like things, but for the majority of, I think, the customers that we are talking to, it's not something that I would advise for.
Right. And just last question from my side, this discussion would not be complete if we don't discuss about the whole agentic AI evolution. I want to know, like, what are the opportunities? What are the bottlenecks today? We are talking about multi-agent systems, and what have you seen? What are you seeing the evolution in agentic?
Yeah, so agentic AI is obviously the next big thing. So finally, we have something available that can implement into the existing business processes and workflows of the bank. What I, however, would be very cautious about is what I'm seeing with many of the customers that we are talking to at the moment is what they are trying to do is like a rip and replace of the existing business process with like new technology. But that obviously is not going to realize the benefit and the value that you can generate out of such kind of like new groundbreaking technology. So when it comes to agentic AI, you obviously need to completely rethink the entire business process and reimagine of how agentic AI could remodel this process to become something that is more intuitive, something that is more like customer centric, something that is more hyper personalized, rather than just having an agent that processes data from A to B with the ability to connect data sources in a more efficient way. So obviously we are at the beginning of that evolution, and working in a regulated industry, we also have to accept the fact that banks typically take those kind of like changes very slowly. So implementing this on a small scale first to realize how technology is working on the long run, and then moving into a larger scale business transformation, I think is something that will happen over the next 5 years.
Right. Maybe I'll ask you a final bonus question. We have like from, I think, 2005 till now, there have been so many waves where we spoke about, what about the core banking solution, or what about the centralized credit bureaus or traditional audit firms? Like when fintech came, blockchain came, I remember there was a discussion about, are we going to now disrupt these paradigms and have like newer form of credit bureaus or a new core banking system or like newer audit firms? Do you think with GenAI we are finally there, like something is going to happen to some of these things?
Certainly there's things that are going to happen, but I don't think it will be as dramatic as we think it is at the moment. I think we have to think about AI and GenAI as a technology that will augment our capabilities to take away all this like low level work of like collecting information, preparing information, processing information to the point where we can then finally make the decision on the information that has been prepared. So AI will greatly help with all these type of activities, so that you as credit underwriter, you as an officer in credit bureau, or you as maybe as a lawyer in an audit firm, you have information at hand that is better prepared, that is more accurate, so that you can make the decision faster and more informed.
Right. Great. This was super fun. Thank you so much, Andreas. I also know that you were unwell over the weekend, so thanks for agreeing to do that while you were recovering. Thank you so much for your time and all the insights that you have given us today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amit, and I really appreciate the questions. It was really fun. Looking forward to the next one. Thank you so much.